Welcome back to another exciting session on the history of Southern Africa, 1500 to 1800. In this section, we'll be dealing with the historical trajectory of Southern Africa up to the 19th century. So we'll consider a number of topics, all right, to have a broad understanding of the development in the region. We've noted in our class that a clear understanding of the geography of South Africa throws much light on its historical development. For instance, we mentioned that the attraction of the Europeans to the Cape, as well as their subsequent settlement there, was a direct response to the geography of South Africa. In other words, for any discussion of South Africa to be meaningful, one should take adequate cognizance of its geography as it influenced the course of its historical development. South Africa is the southern part of the African Plateau. The area is dominated by the Great Plateau. South Africa has coastal strip along the west coast. And also we noted that South Africa does not enjoy adequate rainfall because of its geographical factors. The eastern part of South Africa, for instance, is more mountainous than the western part, and as a result of this, the eastern part enjoys more rainfall than the western part of Southern Africa. We noted how the Drakensberg mountain is responsible for the rainfall in the eastern part, and the rain decreases westward, how it decreases westward. We noted also that the dry western part was the result of prevailing rains bearing southeast trade wind and having lost most of its moisture content on the Drakensberg before getting to the western part. And according to G. Parker and P. Fukani, the high Drakensberg escarpment act as a barrier to the southeast trade wind, forcing most of their moisture to be precipitated on the east-facing slope. As the wind blows into the interior, they are relatively dry, causing rainfall to decrease westward. And basically, the cold Benguela current lowers the temperature of the westward blowing wind, which becomes an offshore wind on the west coast. The resultant effect of this is the Kalahari Namib Desert of the west, where the Bushmen and the Otentos had been driven to. The cold Benguela current, for instance, is also an important cause of the presence of birds whose droppings, the guanos, form an important fertilizing product. Also, following the pattern of rainfall, the vegetation is most abundant on the eastern coast as it grows sparser towards the western part. So there are many rivers in South Africa. As we have demonstrated, basically most of these rivers are to be found on the eastern part. They include the Great Fish River, Limpopo River, the Zambezi River, as we have demonstrated in your map during our class exercise. The wet eastern part is very important for the inhabitants, as there are many well-watered areas along the area. So there are also a number of water holes around which populations are concentrated. However, we should bear in mind also that the mountains or the mountainous nature of the eastern part of South Africa tends to make it less habitable than it should be. And the only important river in the western part is the Orange River, which in a long protracted dry season period becomes a disjointed collection of pools. The swiftness of the river mentioned above and their low volume of water, especially during the dry season, make vegetations on them almost impossible. And this fact explains why it was initially extremely difficult for the Europeans to penetrate into the interior of South Africa in particular and Southern Africa in general. The Cape Colony enjoys the Mediterranean type of climate, okay, and it has winter rainfall and hot dry summer. So this type of climate, that is Mediterranean type, favors the cultivation of grapes, wheat, fruit, barley, tobacco, and other cereal. So in a way, it could be said that South Africa also has abundant grassland, and with absence of tsetse. Rearing cattle is highly favorable as a result of the topography of the environment. So most of the soils of Southern Africa, of which South Africa is an integral part, are not really fertile, and erosion is conspicuously noticeable in the eastern part. So these geographical factors enumerated above profoundly affected historical development of the whole Southern Africa, and most especially South Africa. The geography of South Africa encouraged the settlement of the white elements at the Cape. It is also a major factor to explain pastoralism among the Bantu groups of South Africa, and as we've demonstrated, a pattern of settlement of the Bantu groups and their movement in Southern Africa could be explained through geographical factors. It was also in consequence of these geographical factors that Africans were pushed to the less fertile areas, such as the Bushmen, the San, and the Otentos, the Khoi Khoi, who were pushed to the Kalahari desert by the white settlers. Also is that geographical factors can be best explained why certain occupations like pastoralism, agriculture, and mining are done in certain parts of Southern Africa. The expansion of the white settlers into the interior was also necessitated by geographical factors. According to Arthur Kippel Jones, the direction of the trekking movement was influenced too by the rainfall. In the words of a particular profound scholar, Macmillan, W.M. Macmillan, but climatic conditions very definitely sets the limit to the colony's expansion northwards, the Vuk trekkers. Okay, so this actually demonstrates the impact of geography in the migration, the great trek that actually occurred furtherly in Southern Africa. So in this dimension, it is important to understand how the geographical factor affected human settlement and even economic and social activities. It can therefore be concluded that, like any other country in any part of the world, the historical development in South Africa, as well as the whole of Southern Africa, is greatly shaped or influenced by geographical factors. So at this juncture, we'll then consider the people of Southern Africa up to 1800. As we have demonstrated, the southernmost part of Africa under our discussion is bordered by the west by the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, it's bordered in the west by the Atlantic Ocean, to the north from the Cape Town, up to the east by the Indian Ocean, while the tropical grassland and Zambezi River formed the northern boundary. Southern Africa has distinct topographical features as discussed in our class. Basically, these are the various elevated expanses of land watered by a network of rivers which leaves behind deep gorges in the valley. And apart from the mountainous plateau and rivers that empty themselves into the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, there is also the large expanse of arid land called the Kalahari Desert. So while the series of islands, that is the Drakensberg Mountain and the river with temperate climate, characterize the eastern half of the region, the western half is mainly made up of the deserts, with the Cape Town region, which enjoys a Mediterranean climate, being an exception basically in the region. The Drakensberg Mountain acts as a natural barrier between the arid Kalahari Desert and the rain belt in the east, and therefore signifies a vegetational divide in the region. The landscape of Southern Africa has greatly been dictated the vegetational and climatic conditions of the area. From the eastern coast to the interior westward, the vegetation becomes thinner and more sparsely forested, and after the Drakensberg Island, it gradually merges with the arid Kalahari Desert. If you have watched, if you are keen with the geographical description or mapping of the area, and this is because the sources of water, rivers and rainfall are much more common in the eastern side of the Drakensberg Mountain than in the west. So as a result, the more forested eastern half can sustain a larger farming population than the west. So this has greatly influenced the settlement pattern of the inhabitants of the region, and largely explains their occupational engagement. For instance, it was noted that due to the arid nature of the Kalahari Desert, agricultural activity is severely curtailed, reduced, and so far only minimal animal husbandry like ranching can be profitably engaging. However, the well-watered littoral areas they have regular supply of rain, and so cultivation of crops could be practiced. So in fact, it is the proximity of the Cape region to the Atlantic that has made it famous for agricultural production of fruit, wheat, and ranching, basically. So we now look at the people of Southern Africa, before the 1800, who were the indigenous people, who were the autochthonous groups in Southern Africa. We have noted in our earlier classes that the inhabitants of the area by 1800 were product of series of movements from within and outside the continent at different times, who settled in different locations. Southern Africa was inhabited by 4 distinct groups of people at the beginning of the 19th century, and these are the San, the Khoi Khoi, the Bantu, comprising several splinter groups such as the Nguni, the Soto, the Herero, and finally the Europeans, who were the last immigrants into the region, with the Dutch arriving first in 1652, as we have demonstrated in our class. So much later, of course, there came a colored population, the mulattoes, who were product of inter-race affairs between the Europeans and other groups. So the Indian population that settled in the region was also categorized with the mulattoes as colored. So these people, or dwellers of South Africa, will be discussed basically in the course of this discussion. So but let's focus on the San people. Who were the San people in Southern Africa? The earliest known dwellers of the region are the San speaking people, often referred to as the Bushmen. Although their origin is shrouded in antiquity, we do know that they had at one time or the other spread over much of Southern Africa. They were gradually confined to the infertile western side of the Kalahari Desert area due to population pressure of immigrants into Africa. Okay, South Africa, south of the Limpopo River, particularly accommodated this growing immigration. A short brownish skin people, the San largely lived a nomadic life, close to the gathering and hunting lifestyle of the old Stone Age man. It was through this means that they obtained food. As we've noted, they were highly improvident, basically because of their pattern of livelihoods. Their social structure also shares the same simplicity that characterized their economic life. The largest social political unit was the hunting band, which comprised about 20 to 300 people. And as we have noted, usually members of a unit were related by birth or marriage and had little or no relationship with other bands. The bands also had no leader, as power was diffused among all male adults. Consequently, decision making was a product of discussion and consensus among adults male who were deemed equal in society. So even though their mode of subsistence living required their frequent movement and lack of permanency in their settlement, they nevertheless had a sense of territory and resisted encroachment into their hunting grounds. The looseness in their social organization was, however, a major obstacle, which we have a major weakness or obstacle to their development. And this is because it made them easy victims to be displaced by better organized and highly ambitious and sophisticated groups such as the Bantu. And we've looked at the features basically in our class. The second group are the Khoi Khoi. The Khoi Khoi, who were also known as the Otentos, they are believed to have originated from ancestors that lived in southern Africa, but whose origin, just like the San, is quite obscure. So as we know, all we know is that they are purported to have migrated from the Central African region to displace the San from the choicest portion of land in southern Africa. Although a very distinct race, they are often regarded as a zygote of the Bushmen and the Bantu. However, they appropriate more to the San, who are their closest neighbor. This manifests basically in their stature, their yellowish skin color, and their language, which is akin to the click sound of the San language. A product which perhaps could be a product of intergroup relations between the two groups. So it is also important to note that there are also agglomeration of this, the combination of these groups. San and the Khoi Khoi were often referred as the Khoi San, among the people. The Otentos particularly were a pastoral people who kept livestock, that is cattle and sheep, and also engaged in some kind of hunting activities. Their women gathered wild foods to supplement their feeding, and as a result, they lived a nomadic life with no permanent homes, but instead resided in temporary shelters made of grass and bushes of caves. They did not just wander endlessly, however, in their search for pasture for their livestock. They, like the San, had a sense of territory and jealously guided it profoundly. So due to their proximity to the San, they sometimes stray into their territories in search for grazing ground, and this often resulted into feuds, into conflicts with them. And in order to preserve clan identity, intra-clan marriages were encouraged, while intra-clan marriages were forbidden. So since they were mainly pastoralists also, the number of cattle owned was the major determinant of wealth and status within the community. Okay? Organized along tribal lines, also, the Khoi Khoi had a more complex political arrangement. The tribe was made up of several clans that were semi-autonomous units. Among the clan, the one regarded as the most senior of them, perhaps the founder of the tribe clan, often produced the tribal chiefs. The choice of a candidate as a tribal chief was based on his individual merits, provided he was from the senior clan. So the chief, whose authority over the tribe was very weak, ruled with the assistance of the clan heads, who were often consulted on major issues affecting their welfare. So as a result of the somewhat confederate arrangement, or what could be referred to as the commonwealth of clans in their political setup, an aggrieved or disenchanted or ambitious clan head could assert his clan autonomy by migrating away to form a new independent political unit. So over time, such units increased in population and developed into tribes. We will now speak about the Bantu people. So as I've demonstrated in our class, of all the African inhabitants in southern Africa before 1800, the Bantu speaking people arrived the region last. By the 19th century, the Bantu, a Negroid people who had begun migration out of the West African region several thousands of years ago, had reached and settled in the central and particularly the eastern part of southern Africa. However, they moved into South Africa some hundreds of years before 1800 in various strands of migration at different times from different starting points. So some came into Southern Africa from East Africa, while others entered the region from Central Africa. So because of their migratory activities over the years, the various Bantu groups intermingled with different people and so exhibited slightly different cultural traits from each other. And this was because in the course of migration, they intermingled with different groups, sometimes absorbing or expelling the earlier inhabitants, basically. So however, they all belong to the southern Bantu branch of the African Bantu family and shared very many aspects of their lifestyle. So among the various Bantu groups that settled in Southern Africa are the Nguni, the Soto, the Ovambo, the Herero, and others. Generally of dark complexion, they are much taller than their Khoi Khoi and San co-inhabitants of the region. They were socio-politically and economically more developed than their neighbors also. So these Bantu groups came into the area with the knowledge of iron working, and this further gave them an advantage over other groups. And scholars have described them in most cases as very fierce and warlike, truthful and honest, holding in great esteem the virtues of hospitality. So they were highly friendly and accommodating people. So the Bantu could therefore be regarded as primus inter pares, that is, among the African groups within Southern Africa. So at the advent of the 19th century, they had occupied effectively the fertile eastern coastal strip of the region and had begun to spread across southwest African along the Great Fish River. Other Bantu groups had also settled around the central plateau area of Southern Africa, where the Kalahari Desert is located. And with the passage of time, some of them pushed further south to the Transvaal and the Orange River area. This is the fact that we demonstrated explicitly in the class. So the Bantu effectively occupied most of the eastern half of the Southern Africa and were beginning to make incursion into the western half of the continent by the beginning of the 19th century. For specificity, while the Nguni group of the Bantu, for instance, settled mainly along the fertile eastern littoral region, we noted that the Soto people occupied the central plateau and were pushing further south. The Herero and the Ovambo were left to find a space for themselves in the southwestern part of the region. And unlike their neighbors also, the Bantu practiced mixed farming as their main occupation. That is, they reared cattle and cultivated crops, and the ownership of cattle was a major symbol of wealth and consequently attracted much attention. As we have demonstrated also, that several clashes between these groups were generated due to the raids organized by the various groups for the purposes of procuring acquiring cattle. So due to their economic lifestyle, we noted that the Bantu were able to maintain a large population and were sedentary than their neighbors such as the San and the Khoi Khoi. The Bantu therefore lived in large communities with permanent homes and had a more sophisticated and social organization, a sophisticated social organization and political culture. For instance, politically, the Bantu were organized into clans linked together by common descent, with each clan having between 400 to 500 members. Each group of clan had a major or one form of ruler, which was chosen among the people. The ruler was called Inkosi, as he was the head of the community, was the head of the highest authority in all political and legal issues. So in this way, the Nkosi performed some religious functions and political functions since he had to intervene on behalf of the community. All right, this is one of the key characteristics, of the political culture of the Bantu that we've noted. And in spite of his white powers, the Nkosi could not afford to be despotic. This was because the various strata of administration that acted as a check to his power was very, very effective. The Nkosi had a body of personal assistants called the Induna. The Indunas who assisted in running the affairs of the state, of the community. And these assistants were usually commoners whose family had no claims to royalty. This was in order to guide against a situation where an ambitious Induna would seize power from the Nkosi. So it was from among this group that the Nkosi chose his deputy, who was regarded as a chief Induna. So following closely to the Indunas in the political hierarchy were also the sub-Indunas, who were often important members of the royal family. The Nkosi had to govern in consultation with these groups because of the power they wielded, in addition to their eligibility to royalty. Decision making in theory was the Nkosi's prerogative, but this he did in consultation with his advisors and sub-rulers, as we have noted. And this was because a refusal to do this, for instance, taking a unilateral decision might result into a crisis if such a decision did not have the consensus of the sub-ruler. So on such occasions, the sub-leader could break away to form a new independent tribe. So in other instances, for instance, splitting of tribes could also be a function of dynamic disputes, which often evolve between the various groups in the region. Okay, so the conflict could emanate as a result of the splitting of tribes, which could be as a result of some disagreement among the leaders, or maybe someone disappear, or it could also be as a result of the demise of an Nkosi, all right, as there often arose struggle amongst the eligible candidate for succession to the throne. So at this point, it could be mentioned again, as you have said in our class, that migrating away to another area seems to characterize the problem-solving techniques of most of the Bantu settlers in the area. So these migratory tendencies by splinter groups usually due to the availability of uninhabited portion of land. So this therefore enable the expansion of the Bantu. So for instance, when it became difficult to migrate as a sign of protest, aggrieved or ambitious individuals had to seek for other solutions, like moving to more open or available expanse land. The Southern Bantu had a complex social organization that rested on the respect for ancestors, traditions, and customs of the land. Prominent among these traditions was the initiation rites of young men of the tribe of the same age groups into manhood, as we have noted. We also demonstrated that it was during this initiation period, which lasted for days, and in which initiates were secluded from the rest of the community, that they were taught the ethics, the values, and the culture, customs of the people, the do's and the don'ts of the society. Also inculcated into them during the period of initiation was a sense of group identity and the expectation and demand of the community from them. So they were also circumcised to signify their coming of age as men, and at the time of the ceremony they could proceed to marry. So with the exception of the Basotho group, female initiation was not a group affair among the Southern Bantu tribe. basically in Southern Africa. So in summary, by 1800, the various African groups in Southern Africa had settled in different parts of the subcontinent with their divergent cultures. The people of the region started with the San, who were later joined by the Khoi Khoi and the Bantu. But migration within the region did not entirely stop, as the various groups continue to expand into other lands when the need for such arose. So in the process, they sometimes trespass on each other's territory, and with one group displacing the other. This often resulted into conflict between them, and in most cases, however, they move into unsettled territories, ungoverned areas for settlement. So at this juncture, we will now move to discuss the European settlement in Southern Africa. We'll consider European settlers in Southern Africa before 1800 and intergroup relations. So I believe that this will enrich our understanding of the historical trajectory of the region. As I've mentioned, apart from the African groups that were already present in Southern Africa by 1800, there was also a considerable European presence in this part of the African continent. Although restricted mainly to the Cape and its environs before the 19th century, the Europeans also played a significant role in the evolution of Southern Africa, basically. Okay, so at least they not only added to the number of the multifarious groups already in existence, but their presence made the occupation of Southern Africa, the region, a multiracial affair. They also added to the complexity of intergroup relations within the region. So we'll look at the coming of the white immigrants into Southern Africa, basically. White immigrants again, and I've noted that the whites in South Africa are a product of historical process which started in 1652 when the Dutch began to settle at the Cape. The Dutch settlements in this part of Africa, as we have demonstrated, was a result of the internationalization of the Southern African territorial waters as a gateway to Indian commerce by the Portuguese. I've explained that in our class. The Portuguese were further joined by other European nations in the trade with India, all right? And the Dutch, which was a seafaring people, happened to have been well engaged in this expansion of commerce to the India. So it is therefore not surprising that the first settlers in the Cape of Good Hope were under the sponsorship of the Dutch East Indian Company, which established the base as a stopover station in the course of their trade with the Far East. So between 1652 and 1800, various European nationalities arrived and settled in South Africa as a result of diverse aims. The French Huguenots, with the consent of the Dutch East Indian Company, came into South Africa in the 17th century. We also noted how their movement to South Africa was necessitated by their religious persecution in France. By 1795, the British presence in Southern Africa had become a reality. Before the end of the first decade of the 19th century, the ownership of the Cape had passed into their hands. The German and the Swedish were also to much later followed the footsteps of other Europeans in settling down at the southern parts of the African continent. Although most of the whites started out as farmers who cultivated vegetables, wheat, and vines, some of them soon changed over to cattle keeping because of the high profits derived from it. So subsequently, cattle keeping group became semi-nomads, as they had to occasionally move in search of greener pastures for grazing. We also noted that the increase in the number of livestock keepers, coupled with the search for new land, further resulted in migrations into the hinterland, and it was this search for new pastors that earned the Dutch the appellation Trek Boers. I told you about the appellation of the Trek Boers, which was as a result of the incessant, unhindered movement into the interior. By 1800, most of the Trek Boers, the Dutch, had moved into the hinterland, almost living like hermits, seldom, rarely communicating with the outside world, but occupying large grazing expanse land. Indeed, we noted that they had moved far north to the boundary of the Great Fish River even by the beginning of the 19th century, as individualists who did not want to fall under any sway of any government control. The Boers tried to isolate themselves as much as possible by going into unknown areas within the interior of Southern Africa. Particularly at the end of the 18th century, the Dutch company's influence at the Cape had began to dwindle significantly, to give way to British occupation of the territory. I told you that by the 18th century, the British had become much more prominent in the political and economic affairs of Southern Africa, controlling and wielding much influence over the environment. So since the various groups coexisted within the same region and had contact with each other, there was a considerable degree of intergroup and interrace relations among different inhabitants. And this relationship, which cut across economic, social, and all other facets of life, had their peaceful as well as turbulent moments. First, among the Africans, there was considerable interactions between the different groups before 1800. Among the Khoi Khoi, the San, and the Bantu, they had peaceful relations, as was epitomized in the intermarriages between the groups and the trade relations that existed between them. There were also moments of hostilities and conflict due to cattle raids and infringement into one another's territorial space. So in times of hostility, the Bantu, with their knowledge of iron working, coupled with their numerical strength and better political organization, often had the upper hand. So it must also be noted that there were also intergroup conflicts, which, as already been mentioned above, led to migrations. The victims of these hostilities between the African groups were often the San and then the Khoi Khoi, but their marginalization was not always without a stiff resistance, as I've demonstrated that it is difficult in the history of mankind to see where men naturally accepted external domination with absolute docility. So the Bantu remained the dominant group before the advent of the Europeans, even though there were resistance to their superiority. Even after the coming of the Europeans, the Bantu had little contact. The Europeans had little more contact with the Bantu, and so both groups continued to bask in their mastery of the various areas they occupied. Clash between them subsequently became imminent as they expanded towards each other. As the Europeans, the great trek, the Boers were trekking deep into the interior, it was just a matter of time before they would confront the most sophisticated groups in the area, the Bantu. Subsequently, conflict was bound to occur between the Bantu and the Europeans. By 1800 also, the Cape Colony, as we have noted, comprised about 20,000 European settlers, 15,000 Hotentos, and about 25,000 African slaves imported into the region during the era of transatlantic trade. Among the Khoi Khoi or the Hotentos, a process of detribalization had begun, with many taking to European ways of life. A lot of intermarriages took place between them and the European settlers, and this resulted in the emergence of mulatto, which I've already emphasized earlier. So they were referred to as colored people. So the Europeans also imported African slaves from India, whom they used as laborers on their farms, and these slaves were at the bottom of the social ladder and suffered all sorts of disability, oppression and marginalization. Although the Europeans of various nationalities, French, Swedish, English and Portuguese, were the majority, basically, all right, but the vast majority of the Dutch origin who easily absorbed the remaining European minorities later took over. All right, so even though there were other Europeans group like the Swedish, the French, the Dutch became the dominant groups subsequently. So the Dutch East India Company perhaps had not only encouraged the fusion of the Europeans but the domination of the Dutch. So it was insisted, for instance, that Dutch was the original and official language in the colony. Right, I told you about a new form of nationalism that evolved as a result of the domination of the area by the Dutch. So as a result, by the time of the British takeover, the Dutch culture and language was quite prominent and profound. However, due to local influences of other languages on the Dutch language, a separate language different from that spoken in Netherlands evolved, and this became the Afrikaner, the African language, Afrikaan, African. This African consciousness acted as a centripetal force among the European settlers, especially when dealing with the African groups. Beyond the Cape province were also the various Bantu groups who had clashed several times with the Trek Boers in the Kaffie Wars of 1779 to 1789 over land issues. So the future promised more conflict, and this did not come to an end until the British crushed the Bantu much later in the 19th century. So the points we have noted in our class and which I'm emphasizing is that even with the subjugation of the African people within and around the Cape, it still remained clear that by 1800 the European settlers were outnumbered by the Africans. This numerical superiority of the non-whites became a threat to them and prompted unity among the Europeans. So it also explains the laws and policies that were geared towards subjugating the non-whites and the rise of racial and apartheid policies, such that by 1800 the European colonists referred to themselves as Afrikaners. Afrikaner consciousness, as we have demonstrated, therefore emerged by the time the British took over the administration of the Cape. And this self-consciousness became an important factor, not only in dealing with Africans, but that which the British had to contend with in administration in Southern Africa. The common outlook of the Afrikaner, the Boers, the Dutch, is best reflected in their attitude towards the non-whites in the colony. To them, the black race was inferior to the white race because of their views. All right, so Africans contributed nothing towards civilization in their opinion, and this attitude was further enhanced or strengthened by their own brand of Christian religion which they brought to Southern Africa. There were by 1800 there were about 8 Christian congregations. 6 of them belonged to the Dutch Reformed Church, one of the Lutheran Church, and the last the Moravian Church. From this explanation above, it is clear that the predominant ecclesiastical establishment was the Dutch Reformed Church, which had a lot of influence on the Boers. And you could imagine, so the Dutch Reform, which was as aggressive as the Boer farmers who moved further and further away into the interior, was it had a lot of implications for the indigenous people. The church inculcated in the Boers farmers the Calvinist doctrine and a fundamentalist religious outlook. So for instance, the church taught the Boers to interpret every word in the Bible literally as the divine truth. So through this doctrine, it inculcated into the boers the belief that the Negro people, the black people, were the cause descendant of Ham. No, while they, that is the Europeans, the Dutch, represented the master race. And it is from this religious perspective that racism in Southern Africa, derived its moral justification for apartheid. All right, so the subjugation of the black to the white race was therefore, in their religious thinking, a divine will or divine ordination. The Calvinist religious doctrine also gave the boers self-confidence and a sense of mission. So for instance, they believed that they were ordained instrument for civilizing the world around them, and this belief was perpetuated, and spread through church sermons and education. So fundamentally, their relative physical isolation, particularly the Trek Boers, from the government at the Cape, helped them to crush and to subdue the people they encountered in the interior. So this is part of the issues we have contended. So in summary of this section, to summarize this section, the picture of Southern African region that emerged at the end of the 18th century is that of a place that saw series of intra and intercontinental migrations, resulting in the displacement of various groups and the dispossession of territories as they exchange hands from one group to another. Among the groups, considerable intergroup relations took place, and they became more and more dependent on each other. So these interactions produced cordial as well as anxious tensions, soaked by all kinds of conflicts. So it was obvious that the foundations were being laid for eventual racial conflicts that characterized the history of the region in the 19th century beyond. So what was needed to ignite the erupting volcano was just the clash of interest between the Afrikaner, the Dutch, with their Calvinist religious doctrine, and the Bantu in the hinterland, who were the dominant African group. And this conflict erupted mainly in the 19th century, and the aftermath of the eruption still persists in South Africa as we speak. So in this next section, we'll talk about the advent of the Dutch and their settlement at the Cape. So what were the major features of the Dutch settlement, and how did it affect the existence of the indigenous people in terms of their livelihoods, the land question, and also development in Southern Africa? Now we can consider the Dutch settlement at the Cape. The Dutch, the advent of the Dutch and their settlement at the Cape Colony. The Dutch settlement at the Cape was a product of circumstances, as we have demonstrated above. From available historical accounts, a voyage from Europe to the Indies by the 17th century took almost 6 months. The crew on their voyage from Europe to the Indies went without adequate fresh meat, fruit, vegetables, and water. And the shortage of these vital necessities like fresh water, fruit, vegetables, and meat often led to the scurvy, which in turn resulted in the death of many of the people on board. So the church therefore became interested in calling at the Table Bay for refreshment. The Dutch and even the British called at the Cape both during their outward and homeward voyage. Their water casks were filled with fresh water at the fresh river in the Table Valley, and this helped them to proceed on their voyage. And according to the historicity which has been provided, so the Dutch and the English ships landed at the Cape basically to obtain water, vegetable, and meat, which was needed for their resuscitation to continue their voyage to India. One of the main reasons for establishing a settlement at the Cape was to be able to supply ships with fresh water, meat, fruits, vegetables that could save many lives, as I've demonstrated in our class. And Otto Keppertons was more emphatic about the circumstances that led to the Dutch settlement at the Cape, when he asserted that the utility of the Cape as a calling place gave rise to the idea of a permanent occupation. All right, you've seen that explanation. So the strategic location of the Cape was a vital point to be borne in mind when examining the circumstances that led to the Dutch settlement at the Cape. The Cape seemed to be the midway between Europe and the Indies. The Dutch, with a view to retaining the Cape as an area or sphere of influence, increased the white population by assisted immigration. The determination of the Dutch to increase the white population could also be viewed as a defensive measure against any attack on the Cape by other European powers. And it was in the light of these objectives that French Huguenots from France and the Dutch nationals were encouraged to settle at the Cape. So early in the 17th century, or precisely 1622, due to the strategic importance of the Cape, the English took possession of the Table Bay, as I've demonstrated earlier. The British took over the possession of the Table Bay in the name of King James I of England, but the king never ratified the claim. So as time went on, both the British and the French were greatly involved in the trade in the East, in the Far East, especially India and East Indies, and the Cape then became more important strategically. The Cape became a source of rivalry between Britain and France over the control of the trade in the East. So the fate of the Cape, therefore, depended very much on the part played by the Dutch in the conflict between Britain and France. Britain, like France and Holland, was aware of the strategic location of the Cape, and this could be explained in the swift occupation of the Cape both in 1795 and 1806. So as Britain determined to forestall French occupation, which could jeopardize her vested interest economically, socially, and later politically in the East, while Britain occupied the Cape in 1795, the Dutch gave it back, the English gave it back to Holland by the Treaty of Amiens in 1803. So Britain occupied the Cape. Britain occupied the Cape in 1806 again and decided to have it as a permanent possession. So as a result of the Cape being a gateway to India, Britain also refused to hand over the Cape to Holland, as she did in 1803, which I've mentioned, but paid 12 million pounds to Holland so as to retain the Cape. So it can therefore be argued from this analysis that the strategic location of the Cape induced the Dutch to settle there. So this claim was can be authenticated by several illustrations which have been given. For instance, Arthur Keppel Jones, who wrote before 1869, noted that the Cape had something of the strategic importance that has belonged to the that belonged to the Suez region since the time of voyage. So international rivalry for trade and power in the East extended to the halfway, all right, and it contributed to the European competition, the scrambling, just as the Europeans scramble for land and space in West Africa. They also did with regards to Southern Africa. And further, L.M. Thompson supported this view when he commented that Britain had conquered the Cape to obtain the control of the sea route to India, and the preservation of that control had been the one fixed purpose of our South African policy, and that they needed to solidify the control because of its strategic location, all right, to their major area of enterprise in India. So another factor that gave rise to the Dutch settlement at the Cape was the geography. South Africa, most especially at the Cape, the Cape enjoy the Mediterranean type of climate, having wet winter and dry summer. So the soil around the Cape also favor the growth of agricultural products like vegetables, like meat, like wine. And as I've mentioned, when one of the Dutch ships called Alem got wrecked at the Table Bay in 1647, and the crew of the ships had to stay for a year at the Table Bay. They planted agricultural products, including vegetables, which served as their foodstuff. So the number of the crew haven't seen how agricultural products, the members of the crew haven't realized how agricultural products like vegetables and wheat performed well on the land. They advised the director of the Dutch East India Company on getting to Holland to establish a permanent station at the Cape to serve the needs of the company. So this request for settlement at the Cape made by the crew on getting to Holland led to the dispatch of an expedition under the control of Jan van Riebeck to establish a settlement at the Cape. And according to Annen and Brown, at first the refreshment station was intended to be no more than a vegetable patch cultivated by the company's personnel. But soon it was decided that farmers growing crops for their own profit would perform the task more efficiently than the company servants working for salary. So, and this was what led to the idea of bringing free boers to the area. So one can therefore argue with a degree of certainty that the geography of the Cape gave rise to the Dutch settlement at the Cape. So also another issue we mentioned was that the trade by barter between the European settlers and the Africans, notably the Hotentos, also encouraged in great proportion the Dutch settlement at the Cape. Initially, the companies itself produced fruits, vegetables, the bartered sheep, cattle and goats from the Hotentos, and also attempted to increase its stock and herd by breeding. So partly because of the reluctance of the Hotentos either to part with sufficient cattle to meet the ever-increasing demand of the company's sheep, or to allow the companies to engage in agriculture, or the company was even finding the cost of maintaining the small settlements exorbitant, it became clear that in the short time it would be easier to release some of the men as free boers and allow them to cultivate and raise cattle on the company on behalf of the company. So despite the reluctance of the company's director, the refreshment station began to change into a colony of settlement. Land was allocated to 9 boers in 1657 for the cultivation of fruits and vegetables and raising cattle, sheep for the company, while they were provided with requirements for the settlement, basically. So in 1717, the company, the Dutch company, had decided to stop the issue of free land owed given to the boers, due to a clash between the boers and the Hotentos, the Khoi Khoi, all right, over cattle stock. And instead, the boers were to obtain a loan of 6,000 acres in return for annual rent. And this system permitted the colonists, the boers, to acquire more land without capital, thereby, erroneously, stimulating the dispersal of the boers more into the interior. So gradually, the boers moved steadily into the interior in search for land to cultivate cattle, to cultivate crops, and to rear for cattle grazing. So the Dutch company, in trying to check the movement of the boers into the interior, but this actually ended in fiasco. It yielded little or no success. Cattle business and tendering for the company was one of the factors that also pushed the Dutch into the interior. So it could therefore be summarized from this explanation that the Dutch settlement at the Cape could be explained in terms of the company's desire to have a refreshment station at the Cape to cater for its ship going from Europe to East Indies. So the strategic location of the Cape as a gateway to India, which the Dutch controlled, when our power was still very supreme, was a critical factor that shaped the domination of the Europeans in southern Africa. They needed vegetables, fruit, wine, which they bartered for other things. They got other European goods, clothes, and all the materials they exchanged with the Khoi Khoi people. So, and this clearly explains why the Europeans moved rapidly into the interior. So, at this juncture, we will speak about the Dutch activities at the Cape Colony between 1652 and 1795. What became of the areas subjugated by the Dutch during this period? So we'll just focus on this in the next section. About the Dutch activities at the Cape. The Dutch East Indian Company was formed in Holland, and it was granted a charter in 1602 from the States General. So this States General was the government of the United Provinces, Holland. The decision to set up a refreshment station at the Cape by the Dutch East India Company was taken by the director of the company, otherwise called the Council of the 17, or the RM Majors. It was this refreshment station that later grew into a settlement and later to a colony. Therefore, it should be noted that the company formerly had no intention of permanent settlement or colonizing motives, but historical development showed and influenced the growth of the Cape of South Africa. We have noted that the year 1652 marked the establishment of the refreshment station of the Cape, while 1795 marked the first British takeover of the Cape from the Dutch East Indian Company. The aim of establishing a settlement at the Cape were the following. They were numerous, but they include the following. First is that the company was to secure the supply of fresh water and fresh food like meat and vegetables and fruits that will serve the needs of the people passing through the Cape. Obtain cattle by barter from the Otentos, build a small fort, and remain in peace with the inhabitants of the Cape. Alright, so while this actually went on, as we have explained, fundamentally it would subsequently transform into a kind of hostility, alright, and aggression between the indigenous people. The pattern of relations between the indigenous peoples, the Khoi Khoi, the San, the Bantu, with the Europeans later was reconfigured into a more hostile relationship, as cattle and land became a source of tension between them. The activities of the Dutch company were manifested in the officials entrusted with the responsibility of the administration of the Cape. And I've mentioned Jan van Riebeck was the first commander of the Cape, and he spent 10 years at the Cape, 1652 to 1662. So under him, the company started growing oats, wheat, barleys, among other crops. As time passed, the running of the Cape settlement became too expensive for the Dutch company. So in addition, the company was equally not justifying the aim of supplying sufficient vegetables and cattle for the ships passing through Cape. So Jan van Riebeck, therefore, in 1657 decided to free some of the employees of the company at the Cape to become farmers, so that they would be able to provide sufficient commodities, especially vegetables and meat, for the passing ships. So the number of the company's employees that were released to produce commodities was 9. The 9 of them were called free boers or colonists. They were granted land for raising the commodities. They were equally exempted from any land tax for some years, precisely 12 years. Okay, so the company in addition granted credit facility like seeds and money to purchase agricultural implements. So the free boers or the colonists were to produce the commodities and sell them to the company on their way to India. So the company monitored the activities of the 9 boers very closely. For instance, the company made it compulsory that the company would buy the commodities produced by the boers at the prices to be dictated by the company. So what still the company was to fix the prices of the produce. So besides, trade with the Khoi Khoi was to be limited only to cattle and tobacco, all right, as stipulated by the Dutch, by the the Dutch company. The boers, however, formed the nucleus of the European settlers during this period. The boers, which the company actually settled at the Cape, constituted a significant portion of the population, the Dutch population, which grew in South Africa, and they have been reproduced up to the modern day. So according to Leo Marquardt, in his popular assertion, he said, whatever objective Van Riebeeck had in mind, the 9 free boers and their families were the first real colonists in South Africa, as distinct from the company's officials, and they soon began to assert their rights as free men by protesting against restrictions by the company and demanding that their interests, as well as those of the company, should be considered. So it should be noted that these trade restrictions placed on the boers will create problems eventually between the boers and the company. And as I mentioned, this was what fueled the migration away from the Cape into the interior. Most of these boers started migrating away from the influence of the government at the Cape. So the company soon faced the problem of manpower in raising enough commodities required to serve the needs of the passing ships, and the company had to embark on ways of increasing the numbers of free boers. As noted, as I've explained, the Dutch East Indian Company under Jan van Riebeeck, for instance, had in 1657 discharged 9 of its servants to become free boers. The company, with a view to producing enough manpower, encouraged mixed marriages, and also imported slaves into the Cape, especially from Angola, East Africa, and even the Indies. So the Dutch East Indian Company suffered initial setback, as Jan van Riebeeck and his men had to contend with different difficulties of shortage of men at the Cape to produce what was needed. Some of these difficulties including the washing away of their gardens by storms, the constant harassment by the baboons and other wild animals which they encountered in the. So Van Riebeeck considered it a priority to solidify the influence of the Dutch government with the much presence of the boers, and the essence was to get cattle and all of that, to solve some of the existential issues that affected the supply of commodities to the Europeans. So with the influx of the boers into the interior of South Africa, as a result of the policies of Van Riebeeck, the crisis erupted between them. All right, the source of this conflict was cattle theft, which was common, and this made relationship between the Khoi Khoi and the white settlers unhealthy. For example, the cattle theft led to the war in 1659, which was termed the First Otento's War. Also, this was followed by various raids and counter raids. The unhealthy relationship between the company and the Otentos made Van Riebeeck to mark a clear frontier by planting a hedge of bitter almond. So he struggled to keep the European settlers within the hedge and the Otentos and the Bushmen outside the edge. So it could be observed that the problem of separating Europeans from the non-Europeans in South Africa stared the companies in the face throughout the period of our consideration today. So after the era of Jan van Riebeeck, another administration was sent to the Cape, San van der Stil, who succeeded Jan van Riebeeck as the commander of the Cape 1679 to 1699. The Dutch company instructed van der Stil to strengthen the settlement and to reduce the cost of administration of the Cape. So during this time, Simon van der Stil, during the time of Simon van der Stil, the settlement gradually became a colony. So in the words of Leo Marquardt, Statis van der Stil was an enthusiastic colonizer who saw the potentialities of the Cape as a colony so utterly that he had to be reprimanded by the director for inducing artisans on their way to India to settle at the Cape. So this was the nature of the colonization of the Cape was entrenched under the coming of van der Stil. So he encouraged the Dutch and the Germans to settle at the Cape. He also encouraged the company's servants to take their discharge and become free boers, basically in the Cape, popularizing the number or increasing the number of the Dutch population in the area. So the new governor van der Stil also explored the immediate hinterland of the Cape Town and beyond, and also set up new settlements at Stellenbosch, which was about 30 miles from the Table Bay. By 1688, the Boer population had considerably increased to about 600, and in the same year, 1688, Simon van der Stil received the largest number of immigrants who were French Huguenots, French Protestants who were running away from religious persecution in France when King Louis XVI of France in 1685 revoked the Edict of Nantes. So the Dutch company therefore granted the French Huguenots, often called refugees, to settle in the Cape, and they were resettled among the Dutch and German immigrant farmers of the Berg Valley, and they were even given the same terms as other free boers. They were given land and all of this to extend. So the settlement of the French Huguenots at the Cape had no strong effect on the development of the Cape. Their skills as vine growers were placed at the disposal of other boers. Their strong Calvinist faith considerably contributed to the promotion of racial segregation along religious lines. And this period of Simon van der Stil also marked the period of political reforms. He had a council of policy which advised him in taking some decisions, even though he was not bound by their advice. Also, there was a council of war which was saddled with the responsibility of defending the colony against attack, either from the Khoi Khoi or the Bantu. All right. So there was the High Court of Justice through which the Boers could put their grievances to company's officials who visited the Cape, and there was the Amaradin, which was set up as a local court to try petty cases. So the activities of the Dutch company continued under William van der Stil, Simon van der Stil, who succeeded. The activities of the company continued under William van der Stil, who succeeded his father Simon van der Stil as governor in 1699, governor of the Cape. He considerably improved the stock farming and agriculture at the Cape. So he also used his office to amass wealth illegally. For example, William van der Stil succeeded in persuading Monta Voknier, who was a visiting commissioner, to grant him farms as well as his colleague. So gradually, he and his colleagues succeeded in owning about 1/3 of the farming land at the Cape Colony. So he even used the company laborers and slaves for his private work. So in the final analysis, the Boers sent protest letters to the Governor General in Batavia against him, and he was finally dismissed from the company in 1707. By the close of the 18th century, or precisely by 1795, the Dutch East India Company had succeeded in turning the refreshment stations into a colony, which was inhabited by about 30,000 people, and there were 4 districts, namely the Cape, Stellenbosch, Swellendam, and Graaf, Reinet in the colony. The Dutch company also laid the foundation for white settlement in South Africa. It has also succeeded in creating or in controlling, in quelling any form of resistance, and also controlling all trade basically in the area. The Dutch company also kept down as much as possible the expenses of running the administration of the colony. And it should be noted that by 1795, the Dutch company had become quite weak, and this weakness and decline was a carryover from the decline of Holland itself, the home country. The weakness of the company could be seen when Graaf Reinet and Swellendam in the early part of the 1795 respectively decided to stop company's rule, and they went away with it. The company could not do anything. The people broke away. They decided to reject some of the policies of the Dutch and introduce a no government system in South Africa. They defied some of the policies initiated by the Dutch company, but because the Dutch government at home in Holland itself was weak, so there was nothing they could do. So it gives the boers the opportunity to take charge of the administration of the Cape. The Dutch company ultimately became bankrupt in 1774, partly due to its weakness and excessive bribery and corruption of its officials. Ultimately, late in 1794, the French revolutionary armies invaded Holland itself, and as the fate of the Cape partly depended on the role played by the Dutch in worldwide conflict of Britain and France. Britain, by special arrangements with the Dutch king, Prince of Orange, and the Cape will be given back to the king, the Dutch king, after his restoration to the throne. And this was the fate of the people of Southern Africa as a result of the surrendering of the administration of the Cape to the free boers by the 19th century. The British came, but the British itself also operated an hypocritical policy in Southern Africa. Initially came after the free boers by imposing its own policies and administration, but later made compromise with the boers to take over and also institute a fierce and a very ruthless system of apartheid in Southern Africa. So at this juncture, we would look at the settlers movement from the Cape Colony to the interior up to 1800. Look at the settlers movement from the Cape Colony to the interior in the 19th century. So as we have explained, the white settlement at the Cape of South Africa was a product of necessity. The white settlement was originally scheduled to be merely a refreshment station for the ships of the Dutch East India Company. The company servants were the early white settlers at the Cape. Alright, they were of various nationalities, for instance, Dutch, German, and French. So when the company wanted to encourage farm work on the larger scale, it allowed some of the company servants as free citizens, and they were given land to farm. So the number of these free citizens, who were also called boers, later increased considerably, and these various people that were settled at the Cape were referred to as white settlers, and they were the people that later, for various reasons, gradually moved into the interior of Southern Africa. The gradual movement of some of these European settlers into the interior of South Africa up to 1800 were caused by various factors, which we have already mentioned, and I'm going to emphasize. First is that the majority of the European settlers were farmers growing vegetables, wheat, wine, and on very small areas of land at the Cape. As their number increased, there was desire for more land to enable them grow their crops and also become successful farmers. However, the land at the Cape, apart from being barren, it was not enough to accommodate the growing number of farmers, and this meant that the only alternative is to move into the interior. For instance, the land at the Cape was practically not enough to afford a lone farm of 6,000 acres in return for annual rent by the increasing number of European settlers. Hence, the European settlers decided to move into the interior in order to have enough land, either for agriculture or for any other purposes, as you have mentioned. So, as Omar Cooper has rightly pointed out, the majority of the whites were farmers, and this meant that as their population increased, they would need more land. The vacant land in the interior was also an impetus, was also an attraction and a ready solution to the scarcity of land at the Cape, which in turn aided the gradual movement into the interior by the European settlers. The company wanted, what led to this was that the company wanted regular supply of cattle. As I've mentioned, they needed fresh water for the passing ships from the Otentos, in return for copper, for tobacco, for knives, etc. But the Otentos, the Khoi Khoi, were not ready to part with much of their cattle. So this refusal of the Khoi Khoi to part with much of their cattle led to irregular and insufficient supply of cattle to the company, and this situation was unsatisfactory to the company's official. So Jan van Riebeck therefore sent exploring parties to the interior, north and east of Cape Town and elsewhere, to induce the Otentos, the Khoi Khoi, to bring more cattle to the Table Bay at regular period in order to guarantee enough and regular supply of cattle. So those who participated in this exploration of the interior, they brought back the news of the news of the fertile land in the interior of Southern Africa. They told Jan van Riebeck that there were abundant unoccupied land in the interior, beyond cattle. So this encouraged the European settlers to drift into the interior, either to become farmers or cattle ranchers. So the European settlers, majority of who were farmers, soon discovered that farming at the Cape was not a lucrative business. So the cost of production of vegetables, wheat, and wine were very high. So the land on which these crops were also grown were not very fertile. So there were also weather vagaries at the Cape, uncertain weather condition, and there was also no abundant market for this agricultural produce, at the Cape. So in contrast, there was a ready market for cattle at the Cape, as meat and animal skin were in high demand. So also was that cattle could be preserved if the demand or the prices for it was low, unlike agricultural products which were subject to perish after some time. Also, to be a successful farmer, a European settler needed enough capital, which many of them could ill afford, whereas cattle ranching provided a very high yielding venture without much capital. And this factor encouraged many of the European settlers to move into the interior with a view to practicing cattle ranching. In addition, stock farming products were needed at the Cape, such as fresh meat, ostrich feather, eggs, etc. And the increasing demand for the demand of the Cape market for meat greatly encouraged cattle farming by the Europeans themselves. And since the land around the Cape and Stellenbosch was not suited for the ranching on any large scale, so the cattle farmers, the boers, the Dutch, began to move across the Otentos land, and basically this actually affected the relationship between the indigenous people and the Europeans. Factor that encouraged the gradual movement of the European settlers into the interior was the idea that life at the interior was less expensive as compared with the expensive life at the Cape. And this idea might have emanated from the exploration into the interior, as the people who went on exploration actually took cognizance of the situation in the interior. For example, much food could be gotten from shooting wild animals, food, or for domestic consumption or for sale, especially the hides and skin for money. And also there was no need for costly clothes and luxury of life as the Cape life demanded. In addition, the European settlers could induce the Khoi Khoi to work as their herdsmen and pay them just little wages. So, and it was clear that the cost of living in the interior was much lower than at the Cape. So this propelled many boers to move away from the Cape and trek into the interior. So it was a critical factor that encouraged the great trek. So also was the policy of the Dutch East Indian Company, including the use of stringent measure to embitter the European settlers, who later decided to leave the Cape and move into the interior. There were harsh policies implemented by the Dutch East Indian Company. The company's monopolistic tendencies were not liked by the European settlers. For instance, cattle trading with the Huguenots, which the settlers engaged in shortly after their settlement on the land, and which was allowed by the company, was forbidden a year after the permission was given. And this was because the company wanted the trade for itself. It wanted to be trading with the indigenous people itself. Because of the profit they will realize, they wanted to boycott the middlemen, the Europeans, whose motive was to maximize profit. And this didn't augur well with the boers. Also, the growing of tobacco, which was a crop that could fetch the settlers much money, was also stopped by the Dutch East Indian Company on the pretext that it will lead to trouble with the Africans, particularly the Huguenots, the Khoi Khoi. And therefore the company wanted the settlers to grow wheat and other crops, but it was not prepared to buy them at reasonable prices, as I've mentioned. So at the same time, the company was compelling them to sell only to the Dutch company. All these policies led to bitterness, and the European settlers at the Cape continued to drift into the interior. So taking cognizance of these policies of the company, which led to the European settlers to move in the interior, it was clear that European settlers suffered from the company's monopoly, both as a buyer and seller of their commodities. So they needed permission sometimes to trade most of their products, to other consumer. And closely related to the policy of the company, which made the European settlers to move into the interior, was the high-handedness of many of the officials of the Dutch East Indian Company at the Cape. For instance, William Andren van der Stil became the governor of the Cape. When he enriched himself at the expense of the company, he used the slaves and and other people, Khoi Khoi, to implement the company's harsh policies and all of that, against the interests of the boers. And this led to the migration of the people away from the Cape. Also, the practice of granting loan, which I've mentioned, of 6,000 acres to each of the European settlers at the Cape for an annual rent, contributed to the gradual movement. So the level of taxation that was attached to these loans and the conditionalities propel most of these Dutch to leave the Cape. And as this has been broadly explained, and it is important to know that by the 19th century, the vast number of the boers who had moved into the interior had almost eclipsed that of the indigenous people combined together.